Another week, another Labour scandal, sleaze afflicts them, lapse against them comes up to their door. It's quite extraordinary how pious they were in opposition, how problematic they find being in government. This week it's Rachel Reeves, who not only didn't obey the law, potentially committing a criminal offence, but didn't obey a law that she actively supported and wanted imposed, enforced on her constituents in Leeds, celebrated when it was introduced. And that goes along with Angela Rayner and her failure to pay the right stamp duty. But actually, what happened to Rachel Reeves, what Rachel Reeves failed to do, is not the problem. There is another and bigger problem, and that is the overreach of the state, which is getting worse rather than better. What am I talking about? What is this overreach of the state? Well, why is there a law that says you have to get a license from some busybody council and pay hundreds of pounds for the privilege to let your house out, a family house, to another family? This isn't a house in multiple occupation. It's not being made into a hotel or a hostel or a bawdy house. It's just being let to another family. And yet the state wants to intervene, wants to insert itself in a way that is quite unnecessary. What about David Lammy? I'm not normally a defender of David Lammy, but he was in trouble with the Environment Agency. What was his terrible offence? Outrageous, shocking, eye-wateringly iniquitous offence? Well, he fished in his own pond, and it turns out you need a license to fish in your own pond. What sort of mad world is this? It's your pond, surely. Your pond in your grounds of your house, admittedly one he's given or was given by the state for the period that he was Foreign Secretary. But why is the state intervening? And what about this person last week who was fined £100, not for committing any crime, but for failing to go out of the house with a bag in which to put dog droppings? The dog hadn't done any droppings, but she didn't have a bag. I think it was a she. This is just bonkers. Or the lady who very sensibly poured the dregs of her coffee down the drain, tidily, neatly, in what you would have thought was an anti-littering way, pounced upon not just by one busybody official, but by three, to try and find her £150 in some mad council area, a Lib Dem council, by the way, that doesn't want people to get on with their ordinary lives. But this was true of COVID as well, that in COVID we had rules that were obsessive and excessive. How much exercise you could take, every detail of people's lives, the state wanted to intervene in. So the lesson from Rachel Reeves is not that she did something wrong, though she did. Not to my mind that serious in the grand scheme of things. I slightly feel there, but for the grace of God, go many of us, that it's easy to trip over these regulations because there's so many. But the lesson from it is not that we should harry her or demand she resigns. Do that if you want, but it's not the point. The point is we need to reform the state so the state does what it ought to do rather than taking on more powers which it uses badly and which undermine law, because if the law is unclear, if people don't know the law, they cannot obey it. And the basic principle of our law, of the common law, is that the law is easy to know, and therefore there's no excuse for not knowing. If the law is obscure, then how can people know it and follow it? But it's about to get worse. This government is going in the opposite direction. Rather than seeing how oppressive this is, it wants to make it more oppressive with a digital ID card. And the digital ID card will be a force of control. It will be used to check on what you're doing and to stop you doing things and to make you get licenses to do other things. It could be used every time you went on a train, every time you went on a bus, every time you went on an underground. With road pricing, it could be used every time you drove the car. It could put your health records with your supermarket records. You could be made to use it every time you check out at a supermarket. And then they could see that you were buying cigarettes or you were buying double cream. And then you go to the GP and he says, you've got to change your behavior because look, I've seen what you're doing and I'm not going to see you next week if you don't change your behavior. It suddenly gives the state the power to coordinate and control through using this digital ID card. The storage of data could be immense, and then they'll use it to make you get permits for things things that you currently think you can do ordinarily. It may be they'll check up on you when you're walking your dog. Who knows? That's what loony councils are doing. It gives the state the opportunity to be intrusive. And you may say, I'm just a loony conspiracy theorist. Why should the state want to do this? Well, the reason is because that's what it does. Nobody would have thought 30 years ago that the state would want to insist on a license for you letting your house to another private family. Nobody in the world would have thought 30 years ago that you would have to carry a plastic bag with you in case your dog did something that it didn't in fact do. But these things have been introduced incrementally, using laws that weren't necessarily introduced for that purpose or introduced for exceptional circumstances and made general. Governments use powers that they have got, and they then use them in a way that bears heavily on the individual citizen. And it's worth bearing in mind that during the Second World War, the point of identity cards wasn't so that you could catch Germans who had suddenly snuck into the country, because they were so few and far between that they were easy to spot, and they weren't checked in that way. They were a means of checking your ration card. ID cards and ration cards come together. The green agenda ultimately depends on rationing. They have tried rationing on price. But there's now a revolt against rationing on price. Why? Because things have become too expensive, energy has become too expensive, and people will not put up with it anymore. They will not be rationed on price anymore. It's too much and it's driven business out. So you ration on use. But you can ration with use once you've got smart meters and digital ID cards. That's why we should reject digital ID cards, and we need a bigger reform of the state. You see, we're spending too much money. And part of the reason we're spending too much money is the state is doing things it doesn't need to do, like regulating relationships between landlord and tenants in a private exchange that should simply be governed by contract law. The state seeks to intervene, but that creates a cost. The state seeks to demand you have a license before you fish in your own pond. That has a cost. Enforcement also has a cost. We are not going to reform the state by becoming a little bit more efficient or cutting fraud or cutting waste. We are only going to reform the state if we work out what the state ought to do, and that what it ought to do is less, and that we cut out whole swathes of things that it is currently doing that are unnecessary. So let's rewind to Rachel Reeves. What does she teach us? She teaches us that the state is doing too much and it's doing it badly, and we know it's planning to do more of the same. This is what needs reform. We need, first of all, to stop it doing more, therefore no to digital ID cards, no to further intrusion, no to creating a system where the state can intervene on a daily basis in routine activities, and then we need to go much further. We need to remove all these regulations that are utterly unnecessary. We have to accept that sometimes adult people make decisions that will be wrong, and they should be allowed to go for it. Some people will sign lease contracts, rental contracts that they then regret. Some people may surreptitiously fish in their neighbour's pond. That would be trespass. It doesn't need the Environment Agency to demand a license. We need a smaller state, a more cost-effective state, and we need to remove these regulations that, by being paid for by taxation, ultimately have a cost on the economic activity of the country, which is making us all poorer. It's also a burden for those who have to fill out the forms and go through the processes of implementing them. They take away productive activity for unproductive activity. So we could begin to balance the books, we could improve productivity, we could boost the economy, if only we learn from the mistake by the Chancellor. But don't worry about personalising it on her. That's not what matters. What matters is what it highlights. In its own minor way, it tells us that there is something wrong with the way the state is structured. That's what needs changing, not the hounding of the Chancellor. Do that if you feel like, but that's not the fundamental issue. As always, thank you very much for watching.